Welcome back to the Belonging Network Summit. Our next guest is Erica Keswin, author of Bring Your Human to Work, a Wall Street Journal bestseller. The book offers concrete strategies to design a workplace that's good for people, great for business, and just might change the world. So a little bit about Erica, if you're not familiar with her work. She is a workplace strategist, business coach, and founder of the Spaghetti Project, a platform devoted to sharing the science and stories of relationships at work. Erica was a consultant at the Hay Group and Booz Allen, an executive recruiter at Russell Reynolds Associates, and an executive coach at NYU's Stern School of Business. She contributes regularly to Forbes, the Harvard Business Review, Entrepreneur, and Quartz at Work, and she is an active keynote speaker on organizational culture who has recently spoken at the New York Times, South by Southwest, and Work Human, just to name a few. Now, in many respects, the future of work has already arrived amid headlines predicting the reduction of jobs due to automation of systems and other technological advances like artificial intelligence and machine learning, just to name a few. It's clear that the way we work and live is transforming. So naturally, this rapid evolution can be unsettling. So since we know change is guaranteed, whether we like that or not, we'll be talking about how humans specifically fit into the future of work. So during our conversation today, I'll be asking Erica to look into her crystal ball and help us imagine a future workplace that allows us to bring more meaning and authenticity into the workplace while having honest conversations around how rapid technological and demographic shifts in the United States alone are disrupting our workplaces. So together, we'll address some of these workplace disruptions and explore how our organizations can adapt to some of the ideas that Erica will share during our conversation. So with all of that, Erica, welcome to the summit. I'm super happy to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Well, let's get going. First, let's kick off the interview and we'll just jump right into your book, Bring Your Human to Work. So in it, you write about this almost universal craving to achieve a work-life balance, sustainable work practices, authentic, purpose-driven work cultures. So that we're definitely in the right place here. So first for us, just to frame the conversation, define what you mean by culture and specifically this idea of human culture.
Great. So if I were to pick one through line for the book and just for my belief system around culture, it's about honoring relationships and thinking about how we as leaders honor relationships with our employees, with our clients, and even with ourselves. And I think if we can look and think through that lens of honoring relationships, and then everything else just comes easier, and it's much easier to align all of these other programs and processes when we have that as a starting point.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you for just that framing. With this framing, can you please share more about some of the barriers that prevent organizations to cultivate human workplace culture to really honor these relationships, as you mentioned?
Well, there are a number of them. I'd say first and foremost that comes to mind is technology. Mm-hmm. That technology, there are great things about technology and there are challenges with technology. But I'm in Colorado, and where are you right now?
Portland, Oregon. So
you're in Portland, Oregon, and the technology is enabling us to connect. We have 15,000 people, listening to this today. And we are leveraging our technology to do that. But where I find people are, kind of going down this rabbit hole is that, and excuse the cheesy pun, but left to our own devices, we're not connecting. We have to be intentional about how we leverage technology, but also how we put technology in its place and connect using other mediums and to deepen those relationships. So one of the ways I think about this is matching the message to the medium. So think about communication along a continuum. We have on one end, we have instant message and text and Slack and then email, then picking up the phone, walking down the hall, or getting on a plane to connect face to face. And all of those mediums are not created equal. But what I see from a societal perspective, and this is not just the younger generations, it's all of us, that we're defaulting to the technology, the technological end of the spectrum, and sending that email. So what gets in the way of a human workplace and what gets in the way of honoring relationships is not pausing and thinking about what is the best medium of communication to help me best honor that relationship.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I have more questions on the tech side in just a bit, but I wanted to kind of circle back to this idea of honoring relationships and getting a better sense from you with your own personal workplace experiences. Can you think of one specific example in particular of how honoring relationships helped you feel a sense of belonging at work?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways that leaders can either do this really well or often fall short is how they welcome people into an organization. And, this whole theme is around belonging at work. And, you only get one chance to make a first impression. And so I've had both amazing experiences and less than, I've had terrible experiences about how do you show up on that first day of work? Are you knocking on the door and hoping somebody sees that you're out there? Or do you have someone who's reached out, who's told you what to expect, who gives you the rules of the road, who gives you a tour? They've already decided who's taking you for coffee, who's taking you for lunch. There's a note on your desk. And so going back to intention, none of it's rocket science, but it often doesn't happen. And so those have been some very positive experience when I've had bosses and then peers who have really welcomed me in to a team. When I was in consulting, I often worked for different teams, and you could see the differences in one versus another. So that's one specific example.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it's like what you said, it's not rocket science, yet it's often overlooked, right? And by overlooking these kind of small details, that can make or break someone's work experience over,
Well, and let's think about this from a business perspective. I mean, turnover is expensive. And if you can think about intentional ways to make people feel psychologically safe, feel that they belong, connect them to the purpose, connect them to other people, they're going to do their job better. They're more engaged. They're less likely to leave, which at the end of the day is good for people and good for business.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to give a little teaser of some of the content that's in your book. So I just want to read this back to you. And you probably know this by heart, but I want to unpack this. So you write, this isn't in the first part of your book, but working human in the 21st century means that we absolutely must come to terms with the ubiquitous digital presence that sometimes feels overwhelming, but can also be a powerful tool for getting ourselves, our products, and our messages out there. Bringing our human to work is both about putting technology in its place, as you said earlier, in order to build strong relationships, and about inviting technology to the table, making good use of everything that can create a more human workplace. So I have two questions from this. There's a lot in this paragraph, but the first piece of it is when you're talking about this ubiquitous digital presence and the idea of like, how can we manage this now, right? Which feels, I think of social media presence alone. For myself, it feels overwhelming. And then because the theme of today is talking about the future of work, how do we think about our ubiquitous digital presence as we travel through our career? So if we're looking years down the line.
Great. So I think about it as, I often call this the 3 Ps. So the first is prioritize. Do you prioritize relationships? And really ask yourselves, for everybody listening today, ask yourself, do you truly prioritize your relationships? And I like to ask myself on a regular basis and people I work with, does your calendar reflect your values? And it really is where the rubber hits the road, whether you're using a paper calendar or it's on your phone, you really can look, whether you're looking at the usage of all the social media or, whether you were online during your lunch hour or whether you actually walked down the hall and went to lunch with a colleague. I like to begin by framing, how are you spending your time and with whom are you spending it? So that's the first P, prioritize. The second P is positioning. How are you positioning or leveraging technology and also putting it in its place, which is what we talked about in the other question. But the last P really gets to your answer, which are protocols. One of the images that often comes to mind, and especially as I've been traveling the country interviewing people at all levels of the organization, is that this is the Wild West. the last year was only the 10-year anniversary of the iPhone.
Yeah.
We forget that.
Yeah.
And so when we think about the use of technology with our teams, when we think about trying to communicate to the people that work for us, how, when, and where are they able to disconnect after 6 o'clock or on the weekends, we still are figuring out how this works. And so what I strongly urge people to do is to think about within their, either the broader organization or with their team, what are some protocols? What are some rules of the road? In the Wild West, you need a sheriff to kind of keep you on the straight and narrow and give you those rules of the road to help strengthen those relationships. So it could be, anything from having the technology in a basket in the middle of the conference room so that people aren't rudely texting under the table, or taking them out for the last 15 minutes to resync and do logistics. At Eileen Fisher, before every meeting, they ring a chime to sort of get people settled and more present before they dive in. And so there's no one right way to do this, but it goes back to this discussion around intention. Where there's a will, there's a way. We are not bad people, but the technology is designed to suck us in. It is designed to give us a hit of dopamine every time we send and receive an email, and we have this false sense of productivity. And the reality is that if you can create these protocols, your productivity goes up, and the depth of your conversations at work also go up.
So you're talking a lot on the protocol side. I want to go back to the second P, the positioning. And in the paragraph that we were just kind of unpacking, the idea of putting technology in its place. And I want to explore more of how do we accomplish that outside of throwing our phones in a basket in the middle of the table. Just kind of recognizing, as we were talking about, the fact that we can communicate across distance, and the fact that 15,000 people are watching right now. There is some kind of connection, but it feels there's still that static, of these kind of one-on-one authentic relationships. And I don't know, are there a couple of other kind of protocols or strategies that you talk about, when talking about this idea of putting technology in its place? Because it feels like it's a train that has moved out of the station, and I feel a little at a loss of how to do that.
Yeah, I think, for me, when in doubt, I go back to this concept of honoring relationships. The world of work is only getting more distributed, more remote, contingent workers. And so we need to think about these concepts, not only if we're all face to face, but if we are remote. And it's about setting intention. It's about talking about your values and aligning your approach to this to those values. And so, yes, you can say, let's get rid of the technology. I mean, it is more than that, but that is a big piece of it. And I think there's a big fear factor as managers and leaders to require or strongly urge people, to even turn on the camera. There's a woman in the book from the company Herman Miller, and her team is completely global. And she said, you know what, everybody, you can dial in, and I know you're all over, but for our one weekly team meeting, it is a rule. You must turn on the camera. And she's funny. She said, I don't care what you're wearing, as long as it's appropriate, put on a bathrobe, make sure it's tied tightly. But we need to remember on a weekly basis that there is a human being behind the camera. And so I think there's technological pieces. I also think, there are ways to curate connection with how people, start a meeting, how they end a meeting. One best practice I often share is assign someone on your team to get on the call 5 minutes early and be the greeter. Because we all know if we have a 2:00 call, everybody's coming on at, 1:55, 1:56, and everybody's looking down at their phone and they're all multitasking. Well, what about if there was a greeter who was like, hey, you're here, how is the weather? Or who do you think's going to win? If the Grammys are coming up, or whatever the theme is, to engage in a conversation. Because the more that we can help our colleagues know things about each other as people, the more we enjoy work, the more, again, going back to a sense of belonging, good for people and good for business.
Yeah, and it goes to, the water, it's kind of like this virtual water cooler, right?
Yeah.
The example that you shared of the 5 minutes before a meeting greeter of, just getting to know who's on your team and kind of moving away from feeling like we're some kind of robots of some sort doing the thing that we do. But knowing who's on your team. I think that's a few really good suggestions. I want to turn to demographic shifts and the future of work. So when it comes to building strong and meaningful relationships across differences, and specifically differences related to individual identities, lived experiences, what are some of the biggest challenges that you see in your work that are getting in the way, and how do we work around those?
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting time. There are some organizations where there are 5 generations of people working under the same roof. Yeah. I mean, no time before in history, because people are living longer, working longer, and there's some great things about it, but there are also a lot of challenges. And I think one of the things that gets in the way of that are these preconceived notions about different generations versus reframing it and thinking about, we know, and we've all seen the numbers about how diversity is good for the bottom line, but we often don't think about diversity as diversity of thought, as diversity of generation, and creating a culture where people feel safe enough, where someone's not going to jump on them from some preconceived notion. And so, whether it's having reverse mentoring programs where, Gen Xers and baby boomers have a millennial. I mean, someone was just sharing yesterday that Estee Lauder has a really interesting program where they match, let's say Gen Xers and above, with millennials. And what I thought was interesting about the example was not only do they have, meetings and times when they get together, but they also have them working on joint projects. And so, being proactive and kind of trying to get rid of, some of those preconceived notions and bringing, having everybody bring their strengths to the table. There are organizations that now have employee resource groups that are specifically focused on cross-generational work. And, I hope I'm not sounding like a broken record, but for all of this, when you go back to this idea of honoring relationships, it puts you in a state where my hope would be you're less likely to jump to those conclusions around, those millennials. I believe that millennials are bringing amazing things to the table. And while many people associate millennials with, wanting to become the CEO the next day, they are bringing such great things to the workplace. They want to work where they can feel a sense of purpose. And as a Gen Xer, I actually wanted that also, but there weren't enough of me at the time to move the dial. And what some people don't realize, because they're only reading the headlines and stopping, at these general, conceptions or misconceptions, is that this desire for purpose actually increases with age. And so, what gets in the way are these preconceived notions. And when leaders walk the walk and are saying, we know that diversity is good for business, it's race, it's gender, it's age, it's different types of schooling, and here are ways that we're going to bring people together and have all those voices heard, that's when we begin to move the dial.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And it's interesting that you shared, as we age, there's this kind of increase or this craving to feel purpose, right? And I feel like that kind of maybe changes the thinking a little bit of thinking about, millennials or Gen Z and really kind of pushing for purpose and being uncompromising around that. It's almost like it's having, some of the younger generations pushing and maybe some of the older generations saying, thank you for doing that. We want that too.
Yeah.
Right?
Who doesn't want that? Sure. And they're really pushing, it's because of them that we're even on this, having this virtual event today.
Yes.
Because they want to feel belonging at work. And if they don't, they will leave. They're not, they need to make a reasonable compensation, but that's not keeping them in a company.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the thread, this kind of honoring relationships and I'm wondering how we can bridge that theme with what you also talk about when looking at workplace values and re-examining them and thinking about those folks who are historically underrepresented or undervalued. And I'm wondering, to what degree have you seen success with some of the clients that you've worked with now or in the past around doing that, around recognizing demographics are changing, we need to do better in hiring people of color in leadership positions or bringing in LGBT people, whatever. But, to what degree have you seen workplaces really kind of start with values and re-examine them and think about how to actually put them into action?
Yeah. Well, it's a two-part answer, because if those two things that you just asked are connected, it presumes that one of the values that the company has is around diversity and inclusion. So I would focus on that in two ways. I mean, the first chapter in the book is all about knowing your values, getting them off the walls and into the halls, meaning, this can't be lip service. You have to see it and recognize people and story tell around it and, bring those values to life. And, I have many, many examples, which I'm happy to share, of companies that do it. So the values piece is know your values, don't have too many. From where I sit, 3 to 6 values is ideal. Companies that have 10, 12, or 14 values, it's very difficult, A, for people to remember what they are.
Yes.
And B, my litmus test is, if you're at that fork in the road and you're asking yourself, should I hire this person? Should I fire this person? Should I launch this product? Should I do this deal? Your value should help drive you. Your value should help, tell you, should I take a right or should I take a left? Yeah. And so that is the first piece of values. And, people also ask, why, there's 10 chapters in the book. There's 10 ways to bring your human to work. Are they all created equal? And while I do love all my 10 children or chapters equally, chapter 1 is first for a reason, because, for those of you listening who are working in companies or have your own, or even a manager in a company, or an employee at any level in a company, when the values are clear and known and lived, it is then much easier to align everything else to those values, from diversity and inclusion, which I'll get to next, to wellness, to giving back, to recognition. I mean, all of these other pieces of a human workplace. So that's my view on values. There are many companies with whom I've done speeches at and worked with who have said, okay, within our top 4 or 5 values, diversity and inclusion is a huge, piece of what we want to do and what we believe in. And so then the question is, well, how do they do that? In one of the chapters in the book, I call it playing the long game. And I do believe that this is a long game. A piece of that, I talk about what I call intentional work practices. So if you don't have in your organization parental leave, bereavement leave, ways for people to work more flexibly, how are you ever going to attract any kind of a diverse workforce? Right. And so that is often, for me, the starting point. I would say, if we're focused on, race and gender, we also have to be very clear about our goals and actually put metrics behind it. I mean, in yesterday's paper, they talked about, it was an email from Fortune that came out after their brainstorm conference, that in 2022, the CEO of Uber's compensation is going to be tied to diversity and inclusion goals. Mm-hmm. So it's a combination of having all of these different, sustainable work practices, intentional work practices, to ensure that you get all different kinds of people interested in your company. And then when you're recruiting for certain jobs, making sure that within that slate, you have women and people of color and LGBT on that slate, getting them in the door, making sure that you have a culture where people feel that they're part of, and that they do belong. And at the end of the day, looking at holding managers accountable for doing this, or it will, I don't believe it will happen as much or as fast as it needs to.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so it's really clear, chapter 1, getting clear on your values. What did she say? Off the walls and into the halls. I really love that.
Yeah.
So, for leaders that are preparing for the future of work, say that they've examined their values and they're actively working on putting them into action. What else would you say to those folks, kind of just getting started on really thinking intentionally and critically around focusing on this concept of the human workplace and honoring relationships? Like, what's next after that huge piece? I mean, that's a lot of work, but where do you guide them? When you start to see indicators of success of like, okay, they're actualizing this, and now let's kind of push them further. What's the
Yeah, it differs for a lot of companies, and partly it's what's important to you as a company and as a brand. Now, what I would say is when we think about what employees want today, that's always a good place to start. The top three things they want, as we talked about earlier, one is to be connected to this broader mission. Number two is professional development. They want to grow on the job. I describe it as up, down, and sideways. The days of 100 rungs in the ladder are over. So many companies decide to really focus on, development, professional development, personal development, because they know that will lead to retention. And another area where people often start is ensuring, it goes in that bucket of playing the long game. People really, really want to work flexibly. And I'm not suggesting everybody needs to work from home 24/7, but there is this desire. And people will say, well, where did that come from? Where I believe it came from is back in the day, think of the farmers. The sun went down and they were done working. Even 15 years ago, 10 years ago, we still felt like after work, we got to come home and be with our friends and be with our family, be with ourselves. But today, it's 24/7. And so my theory behind why this flexibility thing is a critical part of the human workplace is that, the work is spilling into our personal lives all the time. And so there's this feeling that, okay, well, when I'm at work, I need to make sure I work in a place that's also taking care of me as a person, so I can take care of my life, whether it's, leaving at 3:00 for my kid's baseball game without feeling guilty, taking care of an elderly parent, whatever it is. And so if I were to say, okay, where do you start? Those are three things based on what is kind of bubbling up from Gen Z and millennials. But, you might have an organization that's very focused on health and wellness and mental health. That's also a very big focus in organizations today. It's not just about giving everybody a Fitbit, although obviously Fitbits are fine and gets people physically moving. But, how are people thinking about taking care of people's mental health and destigmatizing that? So, it's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. I do feel that you can pick and choose from all of the different chapters and decide where to start based on what you're hearing from your employees and what they need and want.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really powerful book, and it certainly is a roadmap, and those kind of like the 10 principles, the 10 chapters that you write about, there's enough room to adapt to kind of a particular workplace or a particular sector. And I'm wondering, as you're thinking about the future of work and how everything is changing really quickly, what are some of those obstacles that may threaten this idea of a human workplace or honoring relationships that may challenge the next generation of leaders? And maybe what are some ideas that you have as you look into your crystal ball around how to overcome some of those obstacles?
Mm-hmm. I'd say one of the biggest challenges today are the leaders. They have to walk the walk, and it's you can stand up in front of your company and say this is important, but if you're not walking it, if you're not living it, if you're not holding people accountable, it doesn't matter. So for example, if you're saying that, you want to make, there's a chapter in the book called Disconnect to Reconnect. And, within the United States, we take less vacation than anybody. And so if you're trying to prevent burnout and urging people to disconnect, yet leaders are never taking vacation. And if people feel like at 5:00 they're sneaking out the door, those are the obstacles for companies, being able to realize a human workplace. And so I think that'll be an obstacle. It is an obstacle today. I think it'll be an obstacle 5 years from now. And that's probably the biggest one. And the companies that are doing this well literally have leaders talking about this, telling stories around it, living it. I mean, two examples that come to mind. One is the CEO of a company called Keswin PR, and the CEO's name is Barry Rafferty. And Barry was promoted to CEO from within, and she realized that the first day of her transition to becoming the CEO, she had a very long-standing vacation planned to on a safari in Africa with her college-age kids, and we all know how much in advance to get all the family, the dates and the flights and the whatever. And so she decided to use this as an opportunity to show her beliefs and her values and how they were aligned to the company. So on the day that she became CEO, she wrote an email to the whole company and said, one of my core beliefs is never leave a vacation day on the table. This timing isn't great, but, we all have lives outside of work, and I'm going on this safari, and I hope you all take vacation as well. And it was such a powerful statement that people won't forget. On a different scale, but also really interesting, is a guy who runs PepsiCo for New Zealand and Australia, has a personal mantra called leaving loudly. And so, it gets away from this, sneaking out 9 to 5 FaceTime culture, which really does still exist in many places. Now, those places have trouble keeping people, but it's amazing to me if they do still exist. So in his organization, if he has to leave, whether it's for a doctor's appointment or going to his kid's baseball game on the top of his lungs, he's saying goodbye to everybody, making a statement that he is leaving early, leaving loudly, and we trust you, and we know you're going to do good work, but we also know you need to take care of yourself.
Yes. So it's just kind of those two examples is like one setting the tone and modeling, right? And this other piece, which I love, is I'm leaving, and kind of, making that known and setting that culture up too, where there isn't this expectation of, the hours are 9 to 5 or whatever your hours are. And then, the kind of the implicit culture is you still stay another hour after you're supposed to be done,
right.
Right.
It reminds me of a really funny quick story. So I was at a panel a couple of weeks ago, and a very senior woman, we were talking about this concept, and she said that she used to, because she felt so uncomfortable leaving, and she's no longer at this company, and this is one of the reasons why, she would bite into an apple and then leave the apple on the desk. So somebody might think, oh, there's a partly eaten apple. Oh, she's still there.
Wow.
So
oh my gosh.
Funny.
Yeah. I mean, that's real though. And I'm sure there's a lot of people watching saying, that's where I work right now, and I want to change that. And there was one other piece, when we were talking about obstacles, I remember reading in your book is this, I think the number's right, so correct me if I'm wrong, but when we look at stress in the workplace, I think you referenced a number of $300 billion. I mean, I'm guessing related to healthcare expenses. I'm not quite sure how that was.
Healthcare expenses and absenteeism and, depression and stress and all of these different things. Yeah, it's a huge issue at work, which is, one reason why companies are trying to get ahead of this by having real opportunities for, mental health support. They're talking to managers about, making sure that people actually take vacation. It's going back to being intentional. It's living the values. One example that comes to mind with what you just brought up, I spoke with a manager at Google, and they have a lot of analytics, and they're tracking vacation days and all of that. And he told me that when he gets to a point where he accrues X amount of vacation days, he gets I guess you can call it a nudge. He gets an email from HR saying hey John, notice that you have a bunch of vacation days, maybe you should think about taking some time off. And he said that until he takes some and that number goes down, he will get an email from HR every 10 days or so.
Wow. Wow, that's great. I mean, it's built in, and leave it to Google to automate it, right?
Exactly, exactly.
So that's a good way of kind of maybe putting technology in its place, as you say.
Look,
Really,
there's amazing ways, well, or leveraging, like using, it's funny, it's right, it's
yeah,
using technology to help us manage our technology,
yeah,
and take vacation. So, whether it's setting parameters on your phone to turn it off, I mean, there's all these different ways to use the technology to have these alerts to remind us of the importance of other kinds of connection.
yeah, yeah. This is really great. I have two more questions for you. I know you're busy, so this next question for you is just when thinking about the participants who are tuning in right now, what might be one thing about bringing our humans to work, or our human to work, I guess, that we haven't yet covered, that the audience may not know about, that you really feel strongly they ought to?
Let's see. I think an important part of, I guess there's two things that come to mind. One is this idea of gratitude and saying thank you. I think the companies that have this human culture, they just build that in and talk about something that's not rocket science, doesn't take long, and makes a huge, huge difference. So I would say thinking about where, whether it's built into a team meeting or, an offsite or whatever that is, to really recognize people for going out of their way, for helping other people can make a big difference. And, sometimes some people will say, well, bring your human to work and all of these different things. You don't, there's this assumption that many of these solutions have to cost large amounts of money and take arms of consultants to come in. And it's really not the case, that many things are widely accessible and free. So I would say, this idea of gratitude and saying thank you at work can make a big difference. And the last thing I would say is to think about just the role of storytelling within your organization, and how using the idea of storytelling as a way to bring your own human to work. If you have a bunch of leaders that work for you, to make them more accessible, more authentic, so that the people that work for them feel more comfortable, connecting. And so I think that's something that I strongly urge people to do, and connecting this back to what we talked about earlier. Storytelling is an unbelievable way to get the values off the walls and into the halls. So have a team meeting, highlight one value, and give a shout out to somebody who's really lived that value. And it accomplishes multiple things at once.
Yeah.
And so I think using storytelling, connecting it to the values, and even bringing in recognition into the process, or a few other sort of tools or levers in your pocket to move toward creating a more human workplace.
Yes, and it's such a great setup for today. We're talking about the future of work, and tomorrow we're talking about the power of diversity storytelling. So thank you for giving folks that little sneak teaser, I guess. And this other piece on gratitude, I really like that as well. Something that I've seen more recently, I guess it was on a blog or something, was this idea of kind of taking our, if you're in that habit of writing, 5 things you're grateful for every day, if you journal, is kind of moving from that kind of activity to, if you were grateful that someone went out of their way and you wrote that in your journal, the idea is then write thank you notes, so turn those kind of 5 pieces of things that you're grateful for and look at the folks around you. And I think that really complements what you're saying about going back to building authentic relationships with folks. And you can use technology for that. You can always write an email, a thank you note. Yeah.
No, I mean, look, who doesn't like to receive a handwritten note? A number of the CEOs I've been talking to recently, one CEO just shared he writes about 1,400 notes a year.
Wow. Yeah.
But he knows it makes a huge difference.
It does. It really does. So a thank you note is on the way to you for I really appreciate that. And so that our audience knows where to find you, what's like the best place online that features your powerful work, where we can learn more about your book and what you're up to?
Sure. So my website is my name. So it's just ericakeswin.com, which is ERICAKES as in Sam, WIN.com. And what I would also throw out to the listeners, I often say I have 3 teenagers, twin 16-year-old girls and a 14-year-old son. So
you're busy.
Yeah, that's a whole step. That could be a whole separate webinar or chat here about teenagers and technology and trying to teach them how to be human. That's for another talk. But I'm trying to get collectively more Twitter followers and Instagram followers than my teenagers. So what I will throw out is that people enjoyed the talk today. My Instagram and my Twitter are just my name. Tag me. Hashtag belonging at work. So we know you were at the conference today. Tell us something that you liked and I'll put you in the raffle, and I'm going to give away a bunch of free books to the listeners today.
Yes. Thank you so much. That's huge. I mean, this book is awesome. So if you haven't yet picked it up, I really encourage you to give it a close read. A lot of really good concrete steps that you can take to really shift your culture. So Erica, thanks again for joining us.
You're welcome.
For everyone watching, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget, if you want more time with these talks, if you'd like additional resources for doing this work in your organizations, and if you'd like to join our community calls after the summit, you can check out our options for getting extended access to all of the sessions and other helpful goodies using the link below. Every purchase also helps me pay the speakers for their generosity, wisdom, and labor in helping us grow the belonging movement. Thank you, and thanks again to today's featured belonging champion.